I'll just start with explaining the general idea for the track, which will be continued over the whole day, and for the panel in particular. With Herm, we were observing a number of discussions on, especially on XBRL Dev, but also in various meetings across the globe, which were focusing on the special aspects. This can be analytics, this can be metadata modeling, business rules, and specific technical aspects. So what we were thinking in the first place is to transfer some of these discussions to the conference here and to get a group of experts in this area that are working hands-on with the approaches, and also have interaction from all of you. So there are a number of people also in the audience who are very knowledgeable about the topic, and we would like to have as much interaction as possible. So we are not asking our panelists to prepare any slides. We would like them to share their views and interact with you. If you have problems, issues, questions, that's, I think, the best place to discuss it. I'll start with a very brief introduction of our panelists. So Jarry from Bank of France is responsible right now for developing Solvency II taxonomies. Eric's been also critical in the development of the taxonomies for the Eurofiling, the EBA, so the taxonomies for CoreFiling, FINREP, and thus his involvement in data modeling. I don't think I have to introduce Walter from the US SEC and his involvement in the writing specifications, contribution to XBRL in general, to the US frameworks in particular. Mark Goodhand, chair of the spec working group from CoreFiling, author of the specs as well, and facing some issues with how the specs are being used, especially as far as data modeling is concerned. Campbell Pryde from XBRL US, dealing with the US GAAP Taxonomy and critical to the development of the US GAAP Taxonomy, and also I think Campbell will share with us very interesting views on where we can go with XBRL, especially from the analytical perspective. Barteck Czajka from the IFRS Foundation, who took responsibility for the development of the IFRS taxonomy and is facing some issues when the complex modeling aspects must be expressed in the current specification as it is. And we have Bartek as well from BRAG. There is no place for him on the panel. But Bartek, but Bartek is responsible for an approach that is causing a lot of discussions across Europe, which is called data point modeling. Yeah, so a new approach to having a look how the data could be modeled in taxonomies, and that's something what we would like to definitely have as a part of the panel today. What we were bringing as major points, we would like to start with the history, and we would like to discuss very, very briefly how XBRL started with the 1.0 and then going into 2.0, 2.1, how we went into the need for defining dimensions, what's been other architectural and modeling issues. We would like to talk briefly about the degree of dimensionality which would be needed or is needed in XBRL, how to express more relations, how to make XBRL a richer standard in terms of modeling, and which features should or should not be used from the specification. So I think, Herm, would you like to add something, or should we pass to one of our panelists? Okay, so I would like to ask Walter first. I think due to his involvement in the development of the specifications of XBRL, to give us a very brief overview of the history of how XBRL started, what was the rationale behind the first development, and how we moved. I think you were critical back in 2005 when some of the bankers came with the idea of dimensions, so how it all started and how we got where we are.
And these are only personal opinions. No organizations are present here, and there's no patents involved.
Well, I hesitate because it's, you know, it's. I know many of you work with computers. How many of you work with people? Okay, they're a lot more trouble because. You know, they change their minds, they change their views, they get educated, they come with organizational and personal agendas, and every every bit of XBRL or every bit of every taxonomy that's ever been developed, and every specification here is the product of people. Wasn't generated by sort of application of logical rules to a set of axioms. And so it's very, very hard to talk about the history and the evolution without coloring it a great deal with my own perception, and other people will certainly not only disagree but perhaps disagree with the wrongness of their opinions. Okay, so with that caveat and apologies in advance, the original design for XBRL 1.0, there were two very, very clear and competing ideas at the table in those first meetings. One of which was that the idea would be to mark up HTML, which was obviously even in 1999 well-established standard, clearly not going anywhere, ridiculously widely used, and the original design, although we wouldn't have called it that, was sort of DocBook-like, and it sort of had some notion of I'm sorry, what's it called? Microformats. Microformats. It was much more of a microformats kind of approach. And the problem and the issue that arose was that all the people at the table were extremely forward-looking and said, well, no, we really want to get away from presentation and focus on the document. We really want to focus on the data. So that can't possibly be the right approach. And so what evolved from that was something which was very much informed by a notion of relational online analytic processing, ROLAP, where essentially every fact had sort of a value was one part of it, but many attributes characterize, many columns, if you will, or many attributes characterizing what concept is this, what what are the number, how many decimal places, and it was sort of envisioned that we would need more dimensions or more properties as we went along, so it wasn't limited to that. We had other limitations at the time. XML schema was not a standard at that time, so the original was written in a DTD fashion. So lots of limitations, but the original idea was that it was meant to, if you were to look at one of these XBRL 1.0 documents on a screen, it would look very much like a sort of canonical XML file meant to be loaded into an Excel spreadsheet or something like that. And all the focus was really on the instance, right? Not a lot of structure around the taxonomies. Taxonomies were meant to be very flexible. Everything was going to be in a schema, so that in the annotations you would place everything you had to say about the concept and its relations to other concepts. So there would be one taxonomy file. It was a schema. It was just a very enhanced schema. Now, some of you in the audience may be thinking, well, all of those seem like pretty darn good ideas, and too bad about that. So XBRL 2.0 and 2.1 introduced far more structure around the taxonomies, introduced link bases as a general mechanism. People who look back at that and say, well, gee, why didn't you use RDF? Well, once again, RDF was not a standard. XLink was, and we were trying not to use standards that build on things that were not yet standards. And so consequently, and other people have commented on this. In fact, I think it was Ray Lamb who, the very first time I met him, remarked that it seemed that XBRL had reinvented a lot of things that sort of existed in RDF and other standards. And I couldn't disagree with that. It's just that we were speaking in like 2004, 2005 rather than 2001. So all of those things kind of came together, and we wound up with a very complicated specification that that had strayed pretty far from the original concept of what the XBRL 1.0 specification would do. And over time, my perception has been that in the dimension spec, for example, what we tried to do was reintroduce the notion that there would be sort of a large and ever-growing number of dimensions and properties, that they would need some kind of organization that was similar to the link bases, and therefore we sort of built this whole other structure. And I think, in formulas were in part a response to limitations that we discovered in the calculation link base. And of course, the formulas have taken on a life of their own. Portions of the original XBRL 2.1 spec that gave a very, very flexible notion of units, for example, units of measure. Turned out that you know, it sort of sounds good, but in fact, the reality is that that's actually not a kind of variability you want. You don't really want different people using different abbreviations and different conventions for US dollars or anything else that's already an ISO standard. So once again, one of the things I've tried to do over the last year has been to reintroduce those kinds of constraints at a very low data level. It's like, let's all just use these ISO codes and sort of force the have the validators check them. Now, if all that sounds as though, you know, we're trying to, you know, I'm trying to take us backwards, you know, that's probably right. On the other hand, I am only one guy. We've got a very large community, a huge installed base of large taxonomies, and God knows at the SEC, you know, I'm subject to all kinds of constraints that have nothing to do with the technology. So some SEC forms, for example, are very constrained. They say you got to do this, and then this, and then this, and then this. And others are, you know, very free form. And so, of course, if you build taxonomies for those, you know, you get very different looking architectures. But I've tried to keep those all within, you know, within the XBRL, you know, basically use the conventions of XBRL where they are. Okay, well, that was probably like 15 minutes. And so that's it. That's the story of the tale of XBRL.
Thank you very much, Walter. I think it's showing us very, very nicely how it all started. I would like to pass right now to Mark Goodhand. So we will stay for a second in the specification work before we move to the application of specifications, taxonomies in particular. But Mark, as a chair of the spec working group, could you just flesh a bit on how the 2.1 dimensions tuples is all working together, and what's your view on do we need something in the future, or is it enough? So just give us some more background from the spec point of view before we just pass to the applicability of them in the taxonomies and the other modeling aspects.
Okay, so I got involved in the XBRL 2.1 spec shortly after I went to REC. Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry.
So I was having to get up to speed with a lot of the background that Walter was just describing, all the design decisions that went into the use of X-Link and how we came to have this fairly unique approach with XBRL, which was in many ways unlike traditional XML. A lot of the hierarchy that you typically get was flattened away. So in the instances, you would have effectively a bag of dimensionally qualified facts rather than a deeply nested structure. We did have tuples, and I think they were used a lot more back then than they are today. But they didn't sit very comfortably really with the XBRL model, which was this idea of these facts qualified by dimensions. So you could have facts clustered in a tuple, but each of them, in theory, could have different contexts. What does that mean? So we were still figuring out things like that. They were all new. We had these tools available to us, but it wasn't clear quite what the best modeling approach was. So we were working through issues in the specification. We were figuring out the best way to model things. One thing that was clear back then was that a standard approach to dimensions was needed. So the base XBRL 2.1 spec had allowed for extensibility there in the segment and scenario elements, but there was no standard pattern for how you actually model dimensions, and different projects were doing that in their own way. So the next major piece of work was the dimension spec. It's got its unique features as well. Not all of them good, but it did address the fundamental need to have a standard format for modeling dimensions. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
No, thank you.
Do you want to take a question?
Absolutely. So.
Okay. Do you think it's feasible that with the introduction of the dimensional specification, that some of the 2.1 specified stuff that is in there could have a deprecate state that is towards you should solve this through a dimension?
Yes, I'm not sure we'll actually formally deprecate anything, but personally, I don't think there's much need for tuples anymore. I think anything you can do with tuples, you can model using type dimensions. So, but there we are. I get the first very controversial statement of the morning.
Some tuple partisans.
The next 30 minutes.
No, but I would actually, I agree with the first part of what you said. No, anything you can do with tuples, you're actually better off just using raw XML schema. Right? The fundamental idea in XBRL is the context element. Okay, so if you either you need context, either you're going to use context or you're going to use tuples. They're totally incompatible with each other.
I do agree that the dimensional specification places some restrictions on how you're using tuples, because there is a business case for tuples. Look at GL,
Sure.
and look at
And look at-
regulators that ask for uncounted number of repetitions for certain data. That cries not for dimensions, but for something repeatable within the instance. And whether you call that a tuple or just normal complex type, I don't care. But then there, the dimensional approach is not the way forward. So I think there is still the use of something that can be repeated within an instance. And whether that be the tuple or not, okay, that's a discussion.
But Roland, if that's what you need is XML schema. You actually don't need XBRL.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. And
yeah, that's true. But it is also that there is a single report containing both approaches. So then you're forced in, if you have a financial report that says I need a financial phase document with some of the dimensional approach, but for certain facts you need to give the details in the same report.
Roland, I understand all that, and everybody up here probably understands that. But let me reemphasize the point here. What I was saying earlier about the history of XBRL, it was a very, what I'm saying is not new here. It was very early recognition that if what you want is something with, bounded numbers of repetitions and rigid structure, rigid structures, and if that's what it is, that's actually not what XBRL is for. You actually shouldn't be using XBRL if that's your main constraint. If, on the other hand, the idea is you actually have very open-ended documents, which could be a mix of text and different periods and many different properties, and like Swiss cheese. Apologies to any Swiss here. Swiss cheese in the sense that it's only it's portions of a total document. It's not an entire document. You're just in the wrong design space. If your system doesn't need that, if that's not the nature of the data collection problem, you really should not be, honestly, you should not be using XBRL.
And if I could just give a practical example of that with HMRC, the tax authority in the UK, they had both requirements. They had a form, very much a form-based approach, where they had a set number of fields that they knew they needed. For that bit, they used XML, and they also had some free-form accounts that go along with it, and for that, they used XBRL. So I think it's about using XBRL, inline XBRL, XML, all where it's most appropriate.
I have a question about the French cheese, because we're a little more than Swiss cheese.
In America, we call it Swiss cheese. It's like French fries.
It's impossible to govern a country which has 400 cheeses, you know that, it's Charles de Gaulle. So I don't know if it's the proper time now, okay, to go through tuples versus, okay, type dimension or XML. I fully agree with Walter, okay. For me, the most important is we must be business model driven. So when there is a business requirement for a financial or non-financial reporting, we must find a solution that will express it in a standardized way named XBRL. So we must not exclude a business case and tell them it's not XBRL. I think that type dimension, I've been making more than 500,000 of data point, okay, modeling in XBRL and mapping, etc. around the world. I know that effectively type dimension are a wonderful solution also to have exactly what Walter Hamscher is telling, which means to keep the contextual information above the conceptual information, and type dimension can solve any problem that we are mentioning, except, okay, it is better than tuples, and I'm available to discuss that at any time around a little table, maybe not in a room of, okay, 100 people.
If I may briefly, I would like to keep this topic because I pass to Eric right now. You mentioned, Roland, that we have the issue with repeatable structures, and I think Eric right now has a beautiful challenge in the Solvency II taxonomies with repeatable structures, which we were discussing yesterday. For some of the bigger insurances can go into 150,000 repetitions, which is quite a challenge, and I would like to flesh a bit if type dimensions are the right way to report 150,000 of insurance assets, if you need to repeat them over and over again, and especially if we have to link them to some way with the formula and to evaluate if a certain number matches with the total of this 150,000. So just to stay for a second with the topic, I will pass to Eric now to just give him the opportunity to give his view on this, the repetitions and what type dimensions are doing there.
Okay. So first, I totally agree with Walter, because in Bank of France, in fact, we have two reports having a long list of items to be reported, and for these two reports, we use XML and not XBRL. Okay. The problem is that it's not only technical, because for example, for EIOPA, it was very difficult to convince them to go to XBRL. And now, if I have to explain that for this kind of reports, they should use XML, I'm afraid that
You're working with people.
Yes, so I think that's the problem. I think our preferred software provider tell us now that in the near future it will be no problem with a long list of repeatable structure. We have the problem, as I told, about validation. So to validate between XBRL and instances and XML instances, this may be possible, but so that's not so easy. So I think that you have to check and to with samples provided by filers, by preparers, and to check the feasibility. But for EIOPA, I would prefer to stick to XBRL for this kind of problem, not for technical reasons, but for political reason.
It's true that the only thing worse than finding that other people have changed their minds is finding that you've changed your own.
I have to say that we have been working with Oracle and Hewlett-Packard recently on a case for credit reporting in the Southeast Asia of 10 million repetition of the same exact group of 200 concepts. And that's evident that we have been using type dimension, we make test benchmarking, and it works.
But I think we're missing the point by focusing on repetition. You know what?
Right,
Let's let somebody else talk.
I would like to pass it on to Campbell to give us a bit of the view of what is the story with modeling the US GAAP taxonomy, and right now, what would be good to have maybe more from the modeling, from the semantic perspective. So slowly we would like to move from the technical area more into the semantics. So we are discussing the technical artifacts. So right now, Campbell, give us a bit more overview of the semantics, which is right now in XBRL, or how it ended up in the US GAAP taxonomy, and from your data analytics right now, would you expect a bit more into this?
Yeah, dimensions scare me, I have to say. I went through and did a little exercise the other day of all the possible combinations in the US GAAP taxonomy of facts that could be represented, given the dimensions and members that we have, and there's less atoms in the universe. So you've got lots of combinations. So one of the things I think we really need to think about in terms of the use of dimensions is just really making sure that people really understand how to use them. We have a lot of situations where people are trying to put attributes on objects, but they're using dimensions to do it. This is something which is a little bit of a problem. So just to give you an example, in the US GAAP taxonomy, you can define a legal entity, or there's a whole bunch of different things that you can define on dimensions, and they're kind of like these objects, but you can't really allocate attributes directly to those objects. So what people do is they create dimensions and they represent the attributes on the fact rather than the object. So this is something that's just starting to become a little bit of a problem in the US. And so what happens is we get people trying to represent this information dimensionally, and so then you end up getting a lot more a lot more information out there which has attributes which are kind of overprescribed, I'd say. So when someone's trying to consume the data, you get into a very tricky situation, because I say, hey, I want stock-based compensation, for example. I go to the line item, I just pull them all out. A lot of cases people won't define the default. They will then dimensionally qualify them. I can look for those dimensionally qualified values. However, they may dimensionally qualify it with another 5 attributes on it. You've got to have very smart systems to try and work this stuff out. So I think that's going to be a challenge. I don't think it's an impossible thing to overcome. It's just a matter of making sure that we have that we, you know, as a group, XBRL US as a group, is just trying to provide tools for folks so they can deal with this. But a lot of people are coming to me and, you know, are really struggling with, you know, how do I consume this dimensional information when it can be further qualified? The other issue, obviously, that keeps coming up is this aggregation across dimensions. Or have folks, you know, we may not have a default value on a dimension, but they kind of want to get the total, and there's things defined. How do they know that they can add these things up? Obviously, formula is going to try to address these. There's obviously issues with that as well. To define a formula that say these things add up, it may not necessarily be as easy to go and understand the formula, understand what the formula is doing, so that then you can use the semantics of the formula. So these are kind of these issues around dimensions that we're kind of struggling with.
Just for the purpose of logistics, we planned 1 hour for the session. For the purpose of marketing, we will have an in-depth session on analytics and business rules, so what Campbell just touched on, this will be in-depth. But I would like to open some questions right now in terms of what is actually the level of I mean, how much analysis and analytics should be driving the data modeling and taxonomies, because that's something what I think is very interesting. And from my own experience, we've been so much pushing the taxonomies from the filers, to some extent regulators' perspective, but not much from the analytics. So what do we really need to do about this data? And that's what Campbell already touched on. So questions, views on this topic right now from the audience or from the panel?
Campbell, do you think that the US, with its SEC allowing for extensions, you are pushing data modeling qualities to the reporter? That's the origin of your problem of how the dimensions are being used when they're filing? Because you're expecting a reporter who is mainly financially interested and giving a fair view of his company and his results, and you're asking, do something IT-ish, correct your data or structure your data in the sense that the US GAAP was being built.
Yeah, and so this is, that's kind of the problem. We were talking the other day about companies creating their own, you know, extension axes and extension members, and you kind of open up a lot of, you know, we talk about extension line items, which I think are perfectly fine. Once you start getting into extension, you know, someone can create extension line items and extension axes and extension members. You start getting lots of different combinations. Obviously, when you analyze that information, the way you analyze then it doesn't become a matter of, hey, I want this information, let me go and get it. Then it becomes, you've got to flip it the other way, and it's like, let me look at what they're disclosing. Obviously, that information's, you can't really do comparison to other companies. Maybe you can do comparison period to period. I think it would be useful in future is if we can put some kind of constraints around how folks, what members people stick on dimensions. And a lot of this may not necessarily, it may be valid to do. One of the things we're concerned about is that just that people are not really sure what they're doing, so they create errors, or they create, you know, models which don't really make economic sense.
I would like to briefly stop here on the point of putting constraints and take a step aside. And we have Barteck here from the foundation, and we have Luis from the FASB. Let's leave for a second the filers aside. I mean, how filers are doing the modeling, it's already complex, but if we just take 2 taxonomies, the US GAAP taxonomy from the FASB and the IFRS taxonomy from the foundation, how is it possible that in many cases the same modeling aspects, the same business aspects are modeled in different, slightly different, more different way if the 2 organizations are cooperating? So do we have an issue there at some different level? So, you know, I think there's the ITA agreement between the foundation and the FASB on which artifacts to use, so no tuples, no tie dimensions, so it's quite restricted. Still, we are ending up in situations that taxonomies are actually different. So if you could just give us a bit overview on this aspect, you know, how many dimensions are used and how I model this, to give us maybe a bit insight why filers are actually having issues with modeling their own extensions there. So let's Louis start on this one briefly.
Like I said, I think Walter answered that because it involves people. But you know, our approaches were very different from the beginning. So you know, you can start right there. The U.S. GAAP taxonomy was built both from the literature, but also based on filings or companies' implementation of U.S. GAAP. And the IFRS taxonomy is built from the literature. So you can start right there, and everything moves forward in a very different path. But you can take, so you take the fact that with the IFRS community, you've got 120 plus disparate communities around the world that have different requirements. And then you take the US GAAP requirement, which is essentially one customer, and you focus on that, and you get a very different sort of play. And so let's take one specific example. Maturity axis. So we have a maturity dimension within the IFRS taxonomy that is dimensionalized. We do not. In the US GAAP taxonomy, we have, we've modeled it in 20 or 30 different patterns, predominantly line items. And the reason we have done it that way is because the literature is very specific. It says, you shall disclose it in this pattern, and therefore we can adequately anticipate all those line items. It was also the way we built it back in 2007, so we had already put the effort into it. And let's not kid ourselves when we're thinking about dimensionalizing something. The amount of effort that goes into creating 100 plus line items is a factor in the consideration, but it's only one variable. But we don't have 120 territories around the world that we're trying to respond to, where you can't really anticipate how they're going to fully disclose that. And so for us, it's a very specific sort of question. If we can adequately anticipate what the line items will be, we will provide for those line items. If I have 120 territories, I'm probably going to dimensionalize it.
Well, I agree with Louis that there is a lot of history behind it. So even though the current standards might be similar or even the same, because of the already existing modeling within the taxonomy, it's quite hard to come up with the same modeling for the new standards, even if they're the same. So currently, well, it's a bit too far probably to go back, and if we were able to sit on the new standard without any previous knowledge, then we probably would have come up with the same modeling. It's just not possible because of the way the taxonomies are already built and used, especially in the case of the US GAAP taxonomy.
If I could just add one point to that, Louis is absolutely right that once you've gone down a particular design path, it's very painful to change. People may not realize that the US GAAP taxonomy that we all are familiar with now, for the first few months actually was a tuple-based taxonomy. And I can absolutely assure you with 100% certainty that there is not one problem anybody has with the US GAAP taxonomy today that would not be 10 times worse if we had gone with tuples. Because if you were going to allow extensions, then people would be extending tuples, they would be making up tuples, and at least with a dimensional approach, it is, like it or not, it's actually a better match to the tables that they present in their financial statements, which, most accountants, that's the way they think about their reporting and their presentation. And so if you just think about the one simple case, right, where if you have one company that is showing its table with, sort of dimension A, dimension B, and another company that is dimension B and dimension A, at least if they have comparable kinds of dimensions to draw on, it won't matter which order they present them. If you give them the ability to define new tuples, one will create a tuple that is nested with A's and with B's inside, and the other will create one with B's and A's inside. That's actually worse than anything you might do with dimensions. So once again, that was actually a deliberate design decision in the middle of that project, to move to dimensions. It was not an arbitrary choice. It is one that we can't change now, but it was fiercely argued, and that was the approach that won because of those kinds of issues. Like I said, there is not one problem that you have with the U.S. GAAP taxonomy today that wouldn't be 10 times worse if we had tried to avoid using dimensions.
I would like to extend this thought on, if we are staying just with explicit dimensions, just to, for the sake of simplicity, we have explicit dimensions. Barteck mentioned that, you know, if the US GAAP and IFRS would be starting from the same perspective, they would end up in the, probably in the same situation. I'm not sure if I agree with this, and I wanted to ask Barteck to just give us a view on what are the new developments for the Eurofiling taxonomies with the data point model. So that what we are coming to the point, degree of dimensionality. So, you know, you can express something, as Walter mentioned, with dimension A and B, but there are some thoughts in FinRep and CoreRep to express something with dimension A, B, C, D, and so on and so on. And, you know, what is the rational level of expressing something with dimensions, especially if you are trying to have explicit definition of every single fact, and if we are not going too far in any of these areas.
Yeah. Panelists. Okay, so first of all, how it all started. We were asked to prepare a data model, first of all, for a number of templates in FinRep, and accounting is very, very complex. So it's, the discussion about dimensions and tuples is nothing comparing to what discussions they have over that. So we figured out that in order to try to figure out what is in this table, we need to apply some approach to break down, slice and dice all this information, and then try to build a coherent set of domains that will be of a single kind. So we'll not mix apples with grapes, etc. So it was only 45 templates. Actually, right now it's 25. When we started analyzing that, we had to write a document of over 200 pages with a number of questions, asking to the business people who invented these templates, what is the data inside? And they spent a number of days trying to figure it out as well. So the easiest way to ask those questions was to try to define these breakdowns and place these questions inside of this specific domain. That was this approach. Actually, there was a nice book and a video that Charlie Hoffman posted to one of the groups on the internet, which is Everything is Miscellaneous, where people try to classify everything because it makes their life simpler. So I like it, I don't like it, it's good or bad. So the same we made here. So we ended up with 40 or 50 breakdowns, and it wasn't supposed to be like this, that we will transform it one-to-one into dimensions. But at the end, it turned out to be the most effective way. So the reason why we have that much dimensions at the same time applied is not because of the technology, but because of the domain reasons, that it was easier and simpler and faster to and more explicit to define the model this way and then resemble it in the taxonomy.
I would like to add a few things. I mean, Machi has referred to this as a new approach. But the truth is that this is the approach that we took in 2005. I remember that the first internal draft of CoreRep that Walter actually helped us to analyze and so on was oriented to template. So we had template and we have individual concepts for each template. But after that, we started to analyze a little bit more with the help of our business experts. What was the content of that information? And we found out that following that template-oriented approach, we were representing the same concepts in the same taxonomy in a different way. So from a filer perspective, that's hideous. Imagine someone that has to extract data from their databases, and depending of the presentation that a regulator wants to achieve, they will have to send the information in a way or another. That doesn't make sense at all. The idea of XBRL is quite the contrary. I think it is important to remind this graphic. I'm sure most of you have already seen, where we can see the flow of information of XBRL from providers, through companies, subsidiaries, regulators, auditors, and so on. The idea of XBRL is to have a common dictionary of data. And this is possible if we analyze the data. So as we said before, when we realized of that, we started to model the data in a different way. So for instance, you can see some templates in CoreFiling where you have a flat list of items, but those items are represented using 3, 4, or 5 dimensions. That's CoreFiling 2005. What's been the difference? Well, the difference is that that model was done by IT experts. Actually, I participate a lot in that definition, so I can tell that. When I did this model, I felt like if I were a blind person trying to describe a picture with the help of someone that can understand the picture. What has changed now is that the analysis of the model is being done by domain experts. And the interesting approach that Bartosz has mentioned is the data point that we are talking about is nothing but a methodological approach to understand what the data is. So as a result of that, what we have discovered is that the different templates that we have in FinRep now or in CoreFiling and so on have a lot of concepts in common that are not explicitly expressed in the graphical representation of those templates. However, they are explicitly expressed in the guidelines. And when we use XBRL, what we want to model is the information, not just the graphical representation. So as a consequence of that, what we have is, well, we have a model that has maybe 30–40% more dimensions that we have with the previous models. However, it is consistent. If you have a concept model as a dimension in a template, it is modeled as a dimension, as the very same dimension in a different template, and so on. So from a filer perspective, the model is consistent. So what we expect with this is that the possibility of automatizing the extraction of the information from the original systems to XBRL files will be easier, and will be also easier to trace back. That for a supervisor is quite an important thing.
Just one comment. Are we not coming back to what Walter mentioned at the very beginning? This 2 points that were on the table back in '99. That, you know, are we doing something what is oriented towards rendering, or are we talking about data? So that's I think the discussion that XBRL has in itself from the very origin. So Bartek, what do you think about this?
Yeah, just one more thing to add. Indeed, right now that business experts, the domain experts in the banking supervision in Europe are aware of this approach. It's easy to draw a table and require some information from the banks, but actually sometimes it's difficult to explain what is inside of this table. And with this consistent modeling, what turned out is that right now that they are inventing some new information to be reported, they think in terms of these breakdowns. So they said, okay, I need to add a couple of members, let's say, in the particular breakdown, because this is the information that I require. And not in terms of, well, I will define a new graphical table for that, and well, everyone will know what is inside because it's self-explanatory from the headers of rows and headers of columns. So again, this is the same thing, thinking in terms of data, not the views.
Well, to second that, I think that there's a difference between the bank reporting or the FinRep CoreFiling reporting and the IFRS reporting. I'm not sure about the US GAAP reporting, but it's the degree of how much you can put in the report of what you want to put in there, and not what is prescribed by your regulator. And that's also part of the reason why it's much harder to introduce many dimensions. And, for example, to dimensionalize the balance sheet. So, you know, it's also what Walter said, it's people we are working with. And we have asked in the past the public, should we dimensionalize the balance sheet? And 99 or 95% actually the answer was no, we are not ready for that. And it's people thinking of, you know, rendering, presentation, and all these aspects that are not really data modeling, but they are using XBRL and thinking of XBRL not only as a data modeling, but also, you know, how we would see it on the SEC webpage, for example. That's maybe, well, my background is accounting, so for me, dimensionalizing balance sheet also seemed strange. But the more and more I got into XBRL, I think it's a fair approach. That's what it is. If we have continued and discontinued operations, that's nothing more than a dimension that we could introduce. The question is, are people ready yet?
Just to extend on this example before I pass to Luis, I mean, Luis, if you would have property, plant and equipment, or let's say vehicles, yeah, what Bartek would do with Victor, they would say, well, it's base item assets, it's a category of assets, property, plant and equipment / vehicle, it's the measurement at cost, it is current, non-current, non-current, it is whatever else, so it will be like 10 characteristics. It's the way to go for the US GAAP taxonomy in the future.
Well, as I've expressed in different forums, I think what you referred to as the data point modeling, and I like to just call it an Uber hypercube, is the Uber cube, the Uber cube, cube square, cube, whatever, is a way forward in terms of a vision. How quickly we'll get there, if we'll get there at all, is anybody's guess. But I think, you know, when we talk about dimensions today, and you made the point earlier that, well, people don't want to use dimensions on the balance sheet or other statements. We're actually finding, and this is a really interesting phenomenon right now, is that users are getting very comfortable with dimensions. And to Campbell's chagrin, they're getting too comfortable with dimensions. They're misapplying them. And so it's a really interesting dynamic that we have to deal with. So on the one hand, we're learning how to use dimensions more effectively, but we do need to constrain their use. And I'm not entirely sure what's the right way to do that. It's a combination of, you know, what we do in the taxonomy, and dare I say, by using definitions more effectively to constrain the use of certain elements, to maybe some other techniques that we can use to constrain their use, and some educational aspects to constrain their use. You know, but again, to Campbell's point, we're seeing some very odd use that doesn't help. But at the end of the day, the thing that we're most sensitive to right now is how that gets consumed. And you know, I've yet to hear anyone in the analyst community tell me that they can easily consume a fact that has been, you know, dimensionalized by 5 different dimensions, or even 1 for that matter. And that is something we need to be super sensitive to right now, is how is this being consumed? I want to see how that's efficiently and effectively being consumed before we get too crazy with this.
I'd like to pass to Eric right now, just to give us maybe some view. I mean, we flashed this issue with the rendering. So what's the relation between the templates and the data model in the taxonomy? So if I could just hear views from Eric on his experiences there.
Yes, there is working, yes. There is another interest of data modeling that has not been cited, is that the fact that in Europe, CoreFiling is used by several countries, and the meaning of the same data point was different. In some cases, was different between countries because they didn't understand the same thing. Okay. So we fully support the data modeling in Bank of France. The first question that could be asked is XBRL the right way to perform data modeling? We discussed this morning about RDF, and Eric Cohen cited yesterday the sentence, if you have a hammer, everything is a nail. So we have the same hammer than Bartosz, and we have happy to see nails. But some question about ODM or OWL RDF that could be used. But anyway, XBRL could be seen as a concrete syntax for data modeling, and we completely support data modeling. What we don't support is that the fact that in the taxonomy is no longer possible to see the business concept. Okay, it's not possible to see property, plant, and equipment. You only see asset plus, for example, for derivatives, there is 11 dimensions. and it's not possible to find the business concept. So our approach, and the approach we want to take in IOPA, is to perform data modeling, but to have a link between the primary items used by the business people and described by the business people, okay, and the data modeled concept. Like, for example, derivative is an asset, okay, with a set of dimension values. So there is a link between the disaggregated primary item and the primary item used by these business people with references, definition, and so on. The problem with what we call highly dimensional taxonomies is like if you can say that the taxonomy is dictionary, okay, we have a chemical dictionary with atoms and not molecules, okay. So it's possible to bring to build the molecules. So we want to have taxonomies having two levels of use. For production taxonomy, use primary items like defined by business people, and with data modeling add-on using some link basis, for example, or other technology we already discussed within CoreFiling. So we could have both interests.
First, data point modeling is where everything starts. I am around the world making new taxonomies, and I tell the people, don't pronounce the word XBRL before we have finished your data point modeling. Data point per data point. And now, when you have finished the data point modeling, which is identification of primary items, identification of dimensions, based on effectively the best practice, okay, in the country where is developed this data modeling. I want to tell you that in Malaysia, we have 1,500 Excel data model. 1,500, not 45, not 70. So we make the data point modeling, and everybody agree with that. We make the analysis of primary items and dimensions. And my position is very simple. As I wanted to understand these not new approach, which is the data point modeling that we are talking about versus what we have done in the past, okay, CoreP or FinRep or US GAAP, etc. You understand that I have mapped every of these data points in several countries. So I know the stuff from the bottom. What I did recently, I took the POC that was published by Eurofiling, and I took the table 03. I invite you, if you want, around the table, not maybe, okay, in these chairs, okay, because it's not easy, okay, to have a straight conversation. I'm telling you, in the first table 03 of data point modeling of Eurofiling, I found 4 errors. I can show them to you when you want. I have that in my laptop. So the problem is the following. The problem is data point modeling is the start, and after that, keep reasonable approach of dimension, like Mike from the SEC said yesterday. You must not be a disruptive technology that disrupt finally the practices and the acceptance of the technology by the users. So the former approach and the new approach are the same, data point modeling based. Second dimension must be reasonably used, not unreasonably used. Third, the most important for me is to keep in mind the goal that we had since Charlie Hoffman has invented, I guess, XBRL. It is for interoperability and it is for data quality. So it means the validation and the modelization are the key of the success of XBRL. If we start to fight, like we say in the 18th century in France, between the modern and the ancient, we're going to really put XBRL at risk. Let's be together. We have to be here making peace and not to defend, okay, one chapel or another. That's what I would like to do in a round table. I was expecting a round table today with all the attendees who have effectively mapped every CoreP or every FinRep of the new model or the ancient model. And I will be very pleased, okay, to have a conversation with them.
Yeah, I'd like to ask our panelists and flash one thing more. I mean, I think we are getting in complex discussions on what are the modeling aspects, how many dimensions you should have, but to some extent what Campbell was mentioned on a couple of occasions. We are getting this dimensions discussion. It's a very important discussion. We will not solve this discussion, this issue here. But I wanted to ask Mark about, are we missing something like what is coming from the object-oriented world? So if we are talking about the interrelationships, to some extent, what is discussed, that property plan equipment is an asset, used to be a general special. Right now we change the focus and we are talking about expressing these dimensions, but there are also other artifacts in XBRL specifications to address it. So we are having a number of possibilities to talk about pretty much the same thing. And if you could just give us some more of the, which artifacts which of them should be used in which cases? Do we have clear answers there, or is there so many of them that it's really difficult to find out the right answer indeed?
Yeah, it is an interesting question, and I don't think there is a hard and fast rule. You often get long debates about what's data and what's metadata. Let's gather this. So obviously, if you do have a collection of different concepts, you could have it as a single concept that's dimensionally qualified, or a set of concepts that are connected using X-link metadata to express the semantic relationships between them. I don't think I'd really like to say which one's better. The one thing I would say about dimensions is it's useful if you have a set of primary items that correspond to accounting concepts that people are already familiar with, and then your dimensions cut across all of those, or at least a large number of them, in a way that makes sense to business users. So we shouldn't get carried away with the purity of the modeling. We should try to keep things in terms that are understood by the domain users.
Mark, when you were explaining to me that you found different taxonomies had different models of expressing linkages between facts. Some might be using X-link in the footnotes, and some might be using a unique dimensional value. I wonder if you could go slightly into that's a little different than the taxonomy side. That's the instance side of interfact relationships.
Yeah, footnotes are another interesting one. And they've seen different use in XBRL throughout its history. There's been a discussion in the context of inline XBRL as to how footnotes are related, because traditionally in XBRL, I think as footnotes were originally envisaged, you would have some ordinary facts and then a footnote sitting at the bottom to explain this number includes the effects of the merger or something basic like that. But often the explanatory notes themselves are quite complex and may contain numbers that are worthy of tagging as facts in their own right. So what you have instead is facts with relationships between them. And XBRL footnotes aren't really a great way of expressing those relationships within the instance. And I'm not sure that maybe other people have seen approaches, standard approaches to dealing with this. But one thing you can do, obviously, is stick an attribute on the fact that relates it to the others. Another would be to put them in the same dimensional context, but I don't think there is really a good answer there that I'm aware of.
Thank you.
That's an important point to make clear. What should be a dimension? What should we, when should we use a dimension? Or where we should enrich the information in the taxonomy with additional maybe X-links or whatever. For me, it is clear. If, as a supervisor, I care about filers, and I care about the quality of the data. And what is clear is that what we want to provide is a consistent approach. It is not consistent if the same concept has to be reported in different ways because in different templates. It is not consistent if there is a version 2 of in-red taxonomy and the same concept has to be reported in a different way. Because what we want is to automatize the complete reporting flow of reporting from the databases in the filers to the supervisors. What we don't want XBRL is to become substitute of an Excel file by falling into the simplicity of saying, okay, columns is a dimension and rows is a primary item, which is basically what our friend Frederick suggested.
Stop, because
Coffee comes in about 2 minutes, so.
Okay, whatever. So, so the important thing is to provide a consistent approach. And there's a big misunderstanding at what we are doing at the moment is that we are providing information that is not necessary. The work that has been done consistent first on identifying all possible properties of the data. And then those properties were reduced to only have as dimensions the properties that identify the fact. So if we thought in relational database extent, what we are modeling as dimensions are the keys. Any additional information, any refinement, actually, I think Campbell make a reference to this, not using dimensions for attributes. That's not part of the model. So what do we achieve by making these identifiers dimensions? What we achieve is that in the future, a new version of a new taxonomy is going to identify the same business concept in the same way. So we are going to give confidence to the filers to invest in automatization of the extraction of the data from the database into the information that we are requiring. As I said before, what we cannot we cannot convert XBRL into the most expensive Excel files of the world, because actually Excel is a standard. If we want to provide a graphical representation of the tables, then use Excel or use Xforms or use any of those alternatives. If we want to provide modeling of the data, if we want to provide a consistent way to gather the data, then let's use XBRL.
At this point, since we're in a highly structured hotel where the coffee comes out when it should, and they actually remove it from the room at the end of the coffee break, I'd like to, all of us would like to thank the panel and the audience. It's been a very entertaining session.